The man who tumbled from his horse onto Ruth Sutton's property on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1878 looked more dead than alive, and if she had been any less stubborn a woman, she might have let him stay that way. Ruth had been at the fence line repairing a broken post when she heard the crash, a heavy, wet sound she recognized immediately as a body meeting earth without any grace or preparation. She dropped her hammer and ran across the dry Texas grass without thinking twice, her brown skirts catching on the low scrub brush that dotted the land around her small homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas. She had lived near Caldwell long enough to know that the cattle trails brought all manner of men through the territory, good and terrible alike, and she had learned the hard way to be careful. But the man lying face down in the dust was not pointing a gun at anyone. He was simply bleeding. He was tall. She could see that even with him collapsed in a heap, and his shirt was dark with blood along his left side, a spreading crimson stain that had soaked through the fabric and crusted at the edges in the dry heat. His horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze, had stopped a few yards off and was cropping at the short grass with the indifferent patience of an animal that has done its part and considers its work finished. Ruth knelt beside the man and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, the way old Doc Hennessy had once shown her when she was a girl helping him in his examination room in Missouri. The pulse was there, thready and fast, but there. She exhaled through her nose. "All right," she said quietly, as though she were speaking to herself because she was. "All right, then." She got her hands under his shoulders and turned him, which took more effort than she expected because he was solidly built, broad through the chest and heavy in the limbs. When she got him rolled over, she got her first real look at him. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair and a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. His face was pale beneath the sunbrown of his skin, and his brow was creased even in unconsciousness, as though he was working through a difficult problem. He wore a canvas duster that had seen serious mileage, and at his hip sat a Colt revolver in a worn leather holster. She left the gun where it was. A man who meant harm did not typically ride alone and bleed himself unconscious before committing it. Getting him from the open ground into her house was the labor of a full 20 minutes. Ruth was not a small woman. She was strong from years of working a homestead alone, with capable hands and a back that had never given her trouble. But he was genuinely heavy, and the door of her house was not wide. She got him inside and onto the cot she kept in the back room, the room she had once thought would be for a child, a thought she kept in a locked box inside herself and did not take out often. She cut away his shirt with her sewing scissors. The wound was a gunshot, clean through the side below the ribs but above the hip, and from the angle of entry and exit she could see that it had gone through without hitting the spine. That was the first piece of luck. The second piece of luck was that she had dealt with gunshot wounds before. Not many, but enough. She had stitched up Tom Gaines when he shot himself through the foot at the Harvest Social 3 years back, and she had helped Doc Hennessy clean and pack a wound when she was 19, and there was nobody else close enough to help. She was not a doctor and did not pretend to be, but she was careful and she was calm, and those 2 things counted for a great deal. She boiled water. She cleaned the wound with carbolic acid that she kept on the shelf alongside her medical supplies, a habit her late husband Daniel had started when he returned from a trading trip to Wichita with a copy of a pamphlet about antiseptic treatment, because Daniel had been a man who read everything he could find. She packed the wound with clean linen and wrapped it tight. She checked his temperature with her hand against his forehead and found it elevated but not yet alarming. Then she sat back in the chair beside the cot and looked at him. His name, she would find out later, was Harvey Covington. But that evening and through the first night, he was simply the stranger, and Ruth sat with him the way she had once sat with Daniel in his final days, keeping watch in the particular silence of a house that holds someone fighting for life. She did not sleep until nearly 3 in the morning. When she woke, slumped in the chair with her neck aching, he was still alive. His fever had climbed in the night, and she spent the better part of the next day pressing cool, wet cloths to his forehead and getting water between his lips when he drifted into something like partial consciousness. He muttered in those half-waking moments, but nothing intelligible, just fragments, sounds, a name that might have been a woman's or might have been a place. She did not try to decipher it. Fever talk was its own language, and she had long since stopped trying to translate it. He broke the fever on the second night. Ruth was dozing in the chair again when she heard the shift in his breathing, deeper, slower, more regular. She opened her eyes in the thin gray light of early morning and found him looking at the ceiling with a clarity in his eyes that had not been there before. She sat up straight. "You are back," she said simply. He turned his head toward her, and even in the dim light she could see the lines of exhaustion carved into his face, and something else, a wariness, the kind that some men wore so constantly they stopped noticing it themselves. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is trying to determine whether the person in front of him is a threat or a miracle. "Where am I?" His voice was rough from disuse and fever. "Ruth Sutton's homestead, outside Caldwell," she said. "You fell off your horse in my yard 2 days ago." He closed his eyes for a moment, and she thought he might drift off again, but he opened them and said, 2 days. "Yes. The name is Harvey Covington." He said it the way a man says his name when he is in the habit of following it quickly with something defensive, as though the name itself sometimes causes trouble. "Harvey Covington," Ruth repeated. "I am Ruth Sutton. Are you hungry?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the one who," he gestured vaguely at his bandaged side. "I cleaned it and wrapped it. The bullet went through clean. You will be sore for some time, but you are not in danger of dying now, provided you do not tear that wound open trying to do something foolish." There was something very close to a smile at the corner of his mouth. It came and went quickly, like a flame touched by wind. "Yes, ma'am. Are you hungry?" She asked again. "I could eat," he admitted. She fed him broth that first day and kept him still the second. On the third day he sat up on his own, and she found him upright when she came in with his breakfast, his jaw set with the effort of it, though he had not made a sound. She set the plate down on the side table and said nothing about the way his knuckles had gone white gripping the edge of the cot. "You could have called me," she said. "I have been troublesome enough to you," he said. "Being troublesome would be bleeding on my parlor rug. You are in the back room, and I have been inconvenienced only a moderate amount." She said it evenly, without any particular warmth or coldness in it, the way she said most things. People had sometimes mistaken her matter-of-factness for coldness when she was younger. She had stopped worrying about the misunderstanding. Harvey Covington ate his eggs and bread without complaint and watched her move around the room with the same quiet, assessing attention he had turned on her that first morning. He had a way of looking at things, she noticed, that was thoughtful rather than intrusive. He was taking inventory, cataloging, the way a careful man did when he had been in places where missing a detail could cost him. "You live here alone?" he asked. "I do," she said. "Husband passed 4 years ago. The land is mine." He received that information without prying into it, and she appreciated the restraint. "You do all the work yourself. I hire Tom Gaines for heavy labor when I need it. Mostly I manage. You are a capable woman, Mrs. Sutton." "Miss Sutton now," she said automatically. "Or Ruth, if you prefer, since I have already seen you half undressed and sewn you back together, which seems to remove some of the formality." That almost smile appeared again. "Ruth," he said, and her name in his voice had a different quality than she expected, careful, like something he was holding gently. She went out to check on his horse, which she had stabled in her small barn and fed alongside her own mare, Opal. The bay gelding had turned out to be well-trained and even-tempered, and she had found saddlebags with a modest amount of supplies, hardtack, a rolled map, a spare shirt, a leather journal that she did not open. There was also a deputy's badge wrapped in a cloth inside the bag, which told her something. She left everything as she found it. When she came back inside, she told him about the badge without preamble, because she was not the kind of woman who held information back as leverage. "I saw the badge in your saddlebag," she said. I did not go through your things. It was visible. Harvey was quiet for a moment. I was a deputy marshal out of Wichita. I am not in an official capacity at present. Were you shot in the course of that unofficial capacity? A pause. In a manner of speaking. She did not push. She could hear the shape of something complicated around his words, the way you could sometimes hear a storm coming before the sky showed any sign of it. She had learned that some stories told themselves at their own pace or not at all. He stayed. There was not a question of him leaving immediately. He was not well enough, and both of them knew it. His wound needed regular attention, the kind that required clean hands and proper supplies, and she was the closest thing to a medical presence within a reasonable distance. So he stayed, and the days settled into a rhythm. Ruth woke at 5 in the morning as she always did and built up the fire and started breakfast. Harvey woke shortly after, and she could hear him dressing himself in the back room with the measured, careful sounds of a man being precise with his limitations. He came out to the kitchen table each morning, and they ate in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. It had that particular quality that comfortable silence has, where you are aware of the other person without feeling obliged to fill the space between you. He began helping where he could, in the way of a man who could not sit still and who could not stand to be waited on. He shelled peas sitting at the table when his side would not let him stand long. He mended tack when she brought it inside, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times. He fixed the leg of the kitchen chair that had wobbled since the previous winter, fitting the joint with strips of leather from his own saddlebag and securing it with a patience that spoke of craft. "You have done this before," she said, watching him work. "My father was a furniture maker in Ohio," he said without looking up. "I learned the trade from him before I went west." "How old were you when you went west?" 23. He set the chair leg down and tested the joint with his thumb. 1871. Came out to take a position as a ranch hand, then moved into law work when the rancher I worked for recommended me to the marshal's office. "You have been in Kansas 7 years, she said. "In the territory, yes. Wichita primarily, but riding circuit through the surrounding counties." He looked up then, and there was something almost rueful in his expression. "The territory has a way of getting hold of a person." "Yes," she said. "I know." She had come to Caldwell with Daniel in 1872 when they were young and the land was cheaper than what they could have found elsewhere, and the Kishom Trail ran close enough that there was always some commerce nearby. Daniel had been a good man, earnest and hardworking, full of plans. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1874, 41 days after they buried the baby, and Ruth had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving would have felt like admitting that all of it had been for nothing. She did not tell Harvey any of that on that first week. She kept her own counsel, but she was aware, with the particular awareness that loneliness teaches, of what it felt like to have someone in the house again. It was on the 6th day that she noticed the bruising on his wrists. She was changing the dressing on his wound. He sat on the edge of the cot shirtless while she unwound the linen with efficient hands, and when he rolled up his sleeve to give her better access to the bandage, she saw the dark ring of bruising around each wrist, the kind left by rope binding. She said nothing immediately. She finished changing the dressing and pinned it clean. Then she sat back and looked at his wrists and said, "Those are rope burns." He pulled his sleeve back down. "Yes." "Were you held?" A long pause. "For a short time, I got free. And then someone shot you while you were getting free." He looked at her for a moment with those careful dark eyes. "Something like that." Ruth folded the used bandaging into a neat square. "Harvey, you do not have to tell me. I'm not asking you to explain yourself. But I am going to need to know if there is someone who might come looking for you here, because if there is, I would like the chance to prepare for that possibility." He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. Then he said, "There is a man named Silas Breck. He runs a cattle operation south of here, but it is not all cattle. He has been taking livestock from homesteaders and small ranchers, forcing them off their land when they cannot prove ownership under the latest survey, or just making things difficult enough that they leave. He has 3 or 4 men working for him who do that kind of difficult making. And you were investigating this as a deputy, unofficially. After I was removed from the case officially, his voice was flat with something. Someone in the marshal's office decided the investigation had become inconvenient. Ruth looked at him steadily. Someone was paid. That is my belief. So Breck's men took you. They caught me on his property where I was not supposed to be. Held me for a day. Then decided that a missing deputy was a bigger problem than a warned-off deputy. So they were going to drive me out to the flats and put a bullet in me. I got the rope off and got out before they managed the second part. He paused. Mostly. Ruth looked at the bandage she had just applied. You were lucky. I was lucky to land in your yard. She held his gaze for a moment, and there was something in the air between them that was new, a warmth, a current, the subtle shift that happens when 2 people have been circling something without naming it and one of them steps slightly closer. She looked away first, gathering her supplies. Silas Breck, she said. I have heard that name. Most people around here have. He sent a man to my place last year. Offered to buy my land at a price that was less than insultingly low. It was an insult wearing the clothes of an offer. I told him no. Harvey was very still. Did he send anyone back? Not to the house, but I have had fences cut 3 times since then. I attributed it to drifters. She paused with her hands on her medical bag. Perhaps I should revisit that attribution. The silence that followed had a different quality, less peaceful, more weighted. Ruth, Harvey said. How long ago did you tell him no? Last August. He looked at the window, at the flat, bright Kansas morning beyond it. I need to get my strength back, he said, and it was not in the way of a man who was eager to leave. It was in the way of a man who has just understood something about the shape of the problem in front of him. Over the following days, as Harvey's strength returned in increments, the nature of their time together shifted. He moved out of the back room and onto the narrow bench on the porch in the evenings, which is where she found him one warm night with the sky pressing down on them full of stars, the kind of sky that Kansas produced when it wanted to remind you of the scale of things. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside the bench, and they were quiet for a long time in the good way. Tell me about Daniel, he said eventually, and it surprised her, not the question itself but the gentleness with which it was asked, the way it created a space rather than demanding she fill one. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup between her hands. He was a good man, she said. He believed in things. He believed in this land and the work of building something. He used to read to me in the evenings. He read everything he could get his hands on. He was funny. He made me laugh more than anyone has since. You miss him. I miss who we were together, she said carefully. When you lose someone young, you lose all the years you imagined. The person and the future both at once. She paused. It takes a long time to understand that the future can be imagined differently. Harvey was looking at the stars. I understand something of that, he said. She waited. I was engaged once, in 1873. Her name was Clara. He said the name simply, not with the weight of unresolved grief, but with the matter-of-factness of something that had been examined and set down. She decided that a lawman's life was not one she wanted. She was not wrong to decide it. She is married now to a hardware merchant in Wichita, and I believe she is content. Does it hurt still? No. I think what hurt was the realization that I had been asking someone to be something I needed without asking if that was something she wanted. He looked down at his coffee cup. I spent a fair amount of time after that not being very honest with myself about what I wanted. And now? She asked, and then immediately felt the exposure of the question and looked away at the dark flat line of the horizon. He did not answer immediately, and when he did it was quiet and considered. I think I am getting clearer on it. She did not ask him to clarify. But she was very aware of him sitting there in the warm darkness, and she was aware of herself, of the way her thoughts had begun to orient toward him without her permission. The way you can find yourself facing a direction without remembering turning. It was Tom Gaines who first said anything. Tom came by on a Tuesday with a load of fencing posts and found Harvey helping Ruth take inventory of her seed stock in the barn. Harvey holding the board while Ruth counted. the two of them standing close in the dusty light with an ease that Tom apparently found notable. "Who's this?" Tom asked, stepping into the barn with the forthright curiosity of a man who has known Ruth Sutton for 4 years and feels himself entitled to some information. "Harvey Covington," Ruth said. "He was injured and I nursed him back to health. He's staying on while he recovers." Tom looked at Harvey with the measuring look of a man conducting a rapid assessment. Harvey met it steadily. "Tom Gaines," Tom said, and offered his hand. "I know your name," Harvey said. "Ruth speaks well of you." Tom's expression shifted slightly toward acceptance, because a man who acknowledges that you are spoken well of is harder to be suspicious of. He unloaded his fencing posts and stayed for lunch, at which point he observed that Harvey Covington passed him the bread before Tom had to ask for it and asked him a sincere question about the fence repair technique Tom had developed for the rocky soil near the creek, and by the time Tom rode away he appeared to have decided that Harvey was all right. "He was protecting you," Harvey said after Tom was gone. "That is a good thing." "He is a good neighbor," Ruth said. "We look out for one another." Harvey nodded slowly. "That is how it should be out here," he said. "People looking out for one another." He paused. "It is how it should be everywhere, I suppose." Ruth watched him. There was something in the way he said it, something that went deeper than a general sentiment about community. "You have seen the opposite of that rather a lot, I expect," she said. "In your work." "I have seen men let their neighbors starve rather than share a bushel of grain because they decided the neighbor did not deserve the help," he said. "I have seen small landowners run off land they homesteaded legally because someone with more money and more guns decided they wanted it." His voice was still even, but something beneath it had tightened. "The law is supposed to prevent that. It does not always." "No," Ruth said, "it does not." She was thinking of the 3 cut fences. She was thinking about the offer from Breck's man, who had stood on her porch with a genial smile and a contract, and the particular kind of cheerfulness that men sometimes use as a wrapper for menace. That night at the supper table, after the food was done and the dishes cleared, Harvey said, "I have been writing down what I know about Breck's operation, what I gathered before I was removed from the case. Would you be willing to read it and tell me if any of it connects to what has happened on your land?" She said yes. He brought his leather journal from the back room and laid it open on the table between them, and they sat with the oil lamp burning low and read through it together, their heads close over the pages. It was the first time she had been physically close to him in a way that was not medical, and she was conscious of it, the warmth of him, the faint smell of wood smoke and leather that had become familiar over the past days in a way that she noticed only now in the sudden nearness. He pointed to a passage and she leaned forward to read it, and when she looked up his face was very close, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he sat back slightly and she looked at the journal, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. "That surveyor's name," she said, pointing to a line in his notes. "I have seen that name on the paperwork that accompanied Breck's offer. The man who delivered the offer was carrying a surveyor's document that had that man's signature on it." Harvey looked at the line she was pointing at. "Arthur Reed. That is the name. Reed has been signing fraudulent survey documents. He changes the boundary lines to give Breck claim over property that does not legally belong to him. If I can find the original surveys and compare them, the county land office would have them," Ruth said. "In Caldwell. I went there when Daniel and I filed our original homestead claim. The records should still be there." Harvey looked at her. "Would you be willing to take me there?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "when you are well enough to ride." He smiled then, not the flickering almost smile she had seen in those first days, but a real one, full and warm, and it changed his face entirely, took 10 years off it, made him look like the young man who had come west from Ohio with plans. She felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing the weight. "You have a remarkable smile," she said, without intending to say it aloud, and then felt the color come into her face. Harvey looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open, a little unguarded, as though the smile had taken down something behind his eyes. "You are not the first person to tell me I do not use it enough," he said quietly. "They are not wrong," she said, and looked back down at the journal, and the warmth between them was something she could feel against her skin as surely as the heat from the oil lamp. 3 days later he saddled his horse for the first time, and she watched him from the barn door with her arms folded, ready to tell him to stop if he showed any sign of pain beyond what was reasonable. He mounted with care, moving slowly, and she could see the control he was exercising, the way he kept his breathing deliberate and even. He walked the bay around the yard once and then stopped beside her. "I am fit to ride to Caldwell," he said. "That is a 6-mile ride." "I know." "You are going to be sore." "I am already sore." He looked down at her from the saddle, and the morning light was full on his face, and she thought, with the thought appearing the way thoughts sometimes do, fully formed and impossible to argue with, that she did not want him to leave. Not permanently. Not for long. She went inside and changed into her riding clothes and saddled Opal. They rode to Caldwell on a clear morning in late April of 1878, and the land around them was just beginning its transition into the brief green period before the summer heat burned it back to gold and brown. The cattle trail to the south was already showing signs of activity dust rising in the far distance, the distant lowing sound carrying on the wind. It was the beginning of the season. The world was moving again. Caldwell was a rough-edged town, honest in its roughness. It had the character of a place that knew exactly what it was and had not made any effort to pretend otherwise. There was a main street of wooden storefronts, a hotel that was adequate without being comfortable, 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, and the county land office, which occupied a narrow building between the barber and the post office. Ruth and Harvey drew some looks. She was known in Caldwell a widowed homesteader who paid her bills on time and kept to herself, which in a small frontier town was sufficient for a quiet kind of respect. The man riding beside her was a stranger, and strangers in Caldwell in 1878 were always noticed. The land office clerk was a thin, precise man named Alderson who wore spectacles and spoke in the measured tones of someone who has spent a great deal of time with documents. "I need to see the original homestead survey records for the properties along the South Fork of Elm Creek," Harvey said, placing his hands on the counter. He did not identify himself, and Ruth noted that he had left his badge back at the homestead. "And I would like to compare them with any survey records filed in the last 18 months that overlap with that area." Alderson looked at him with mild suspicion. "And you are a concerned citizen," Harvey said pleasantly. Alderson looked at Ruth. She returned his look with the steady calm she had cultivated over years of being a woman dealing with men who were not sure whether to take her seriously. "Mr. Alderson," she said, "my homestead is on Elm Creek. I have a legitimate interest in my property records. I would like to review them." That was sufficient. Alderson went into the back and came out with several rolls of paper and a bound ledger, and Harvey and Ruth stood at the long counter and went through them with the focused attention of 2 people who know what they are looking for. They found it in 40 minutes. The original survey of Ruth's property, filed in 1872, showed her eastern boundary clearly running along the natural line of the creek, which was the obvious and logical boundary marker. The newer survey, filed in October of 1877 and bearing Arthur Reed's signature, showed the same boundary placed 40 yards west of where it actually sat. 40 yards that contained her barn and a significant portion of her best grazing land. Harvey looked at the 2 documents side by side, his finger tracing the discrepancy. His expression was very controlled, the kind of control a man exercises when something makes him angry and he will not allow himself to be angry yet because anger is less useful than precision. "This is not a survey error," he said quietly. "The creek is a fixed geographical feature. There is no legitimate reading by which this new measurement is correct." "No," Ruth agreed. "He did this to your property and how many others?" They checked the other records. There were 7 other properties in the same area that had received new surveys in 1877 and 1878, all bearing Reed's signature, all with similar discrepancies that benefited Breck's landholding. Harvey straightened up from the counter. "I need copies of these," he said to Alderson. Alderson looked uncomfortable. "I am not sure, Mr. Alderson," Ruth said. "These records pertain to my legal property. I have every right to copies." Alderson copied them out by hand, which took the better part of an hour, and Ruth stood at the window and watched the street while Harvey sat in the one chair and reviewed the ledger again and again. When they left the land office with the copies tucked into the leather satchel Ruth carried, she exhaled a long breath in the bright afternoon air. "What do you do with this now?" she asked. "Take it to the federal marshal," Harvey said, "not the Wichita office. The federal circuit judge is due in Dodge City in 6 weeks. If I can get this evidence in front of him and find 2 or 3 of the affected landowners willing to testify, I will testify," Ruth said immediately. He looked at her. The afternoon light made his eyes look very dark, and there was something in his expression gratitude and something else that sat deeper than gratitude. "Ruth," he said, "you understand that Breck will know what you are doing if you testify. He will know before that, most likely. I know. It could make your situation more difficult before it becomes easier." "Harvey," she said, with a patience she usually reserved for making a point clearly and only once. "He has already been cutting my fences. His man has already been to my door. My situation is already difficult. The only question is whether it becomes difficult and then resolved, or whether it stays difficult until I give up and leave, which I will not do." She met his eyes. "I will not be moved from my land." He looked at her for a long moment. The street moved around them. A wagon passing, 2 men talking outside the dry goods store, a child running past with a dog at his heels. And in the middle of all of it, Harvey Covington stood still and looked at Ruth Sutton with an expression that she felt in the center of her chest. "No," he said softly, "I do not imagine you will." They rode back to the homestead in the long golden light of late afternoon, and the conversation between them moved differently now, easier, with the particular ease of 2 people who have accomplished something together and know they are aligned in their purpose. Harvey talked about the other affected landowners he had met in the course of his investigation. The Morales family, who had been on their land since before Kansas statehood, who had already been forced off 1 piece of property and were in danger of losing their second. Old Mr. Whitfield, who had been ranching in the territory for 20 years and whose entire operation was now technically on Breck's claimed land according to the fraudulent surveys. "These are people who have built their lives here," Harvey said, and there was a quiet fury in it, controlled but present. "Yes," Ruth said, "they have. The law exists to protect them. When it fails at that, when men in positions of authority allow themselves to be bought away from that protection," he stopped himself. She could see the effort of it. "You take it personally," she said. "It was not a criticism. When it is actual people losing actual things they built with actual work," he said, "I find the personal and the professional difficult to separate." Ruth rode opal for a moment with her thoughts. "That is not a flaw," she said. "Men who can perfectly separate the personal from the professional when injustice is happening have found a way to not see the people being harmed. I do not think that is something to aspire to." Harvey was quiet for a moment, then said, "You have a way of naming things clearly. I grew up in a house where the adults talked around things until everyone was confused," she said. "I decided early that I did not want to live that way. What was your family like?" It was the kind of question she often deflected, but something about the easy quality of the afternoon and the way he asked made her answer it honestly. "My father was a preacher," she said. "A genuine one. I think he believed what he said, but he was better at speaking to congregations than to his own family. My mother was the most capable woman I have ever known, and she never once got credit for any of it. She sounds like someone who would have understood you. She would have. She died when I was 14. Ruth kept her eyes on the road. "She deserved more than she had," Harvey said gently. "Most of the good people I have known did." When they arrived back at the homestead, she took Opal to the barn, and by the time she came in, Harvey had started the evening fire and had found the dried beans that wanted soaking and had put them on with water. He was standing at the stove with his back to her, and she stopped in the doorway and watched him for a moment. The set of his shoulders, the way he moved in her kitchen, the fact that he had simply done it without being asked or thanked in advance. Something tightened and then released in her throat. "Thank you for starting supper," she said. He turned. "Thank you for today," he said. "For going with me for the records," for he paused, "for all of it." "We did it together," she said. "Yes," he said. "We did." She moved to the table to set out the plates, and he moved back to the stove, and they moved around each other in the kitchen in the way of people who have been in a shared space long enough to know each other's rhythms, and the small domestic ordinariness of it, the fire and the beans and the plates on the table, was the most comfortable Ruth had felt in years. They ate and they talked about the strategy for reaching the federal circuit judge. And they talked about which of the other affected landowners Harvey thought might be willing to cooperate. And then the conversation drifted into easier territory stories about the strange and human things Harvey had encountered in his year's riding circuit. Things that were funny in retrospect and had not been at the time. And Ruth found herself laughing more than she had in a long while. The kind of laughter that comes up from somewhere genuine. "You have a very good laugh," Harvey said, and he said it the way she had said the thing about his smile, simply, without artifice. She looked at him across the table. The oil lamp was between them and the light was warm and his eyes were warm, and something had been building between them for days and they were both aware of it, had both been carefully and courteously pretending to be somewhat less aware of it than they were. "Harvey," she said. "Ruth," he said. They both stopped. Then Ruth said quietly, "I am not very practiced at this kind of thing anymore." "Nor am I," he said. "I am aware that you came here accidentally and that I nursed you back to health and that there might be an argument that I am—" She paused, looking for the word. "A safe harbor," he said. "And that my feelings are a response to that rather than to you." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have thought about that. I want to be honest with you about the fact that I have thought about it." He met her eyes. "I do not think that is what this is. I think what this is that I came here accidentally and in terrible shape, and you took care of me with your hands and your knowledge and your unflinching common sense, and in the time since then I have come to know you. Not the idea of someone who helped me. You. The person who names things clearly and remembers her mother and would not be moved from her land by anyone, and who laughs the way you just laughed." He paused. "If I am wrong, tell me so and I will take myself out of your kitchen." Ruth looked at her hands on the table. She was quiet for long enough that a man with less patience might have said something to fill the space, but Harvey just waited. "You are not wrong," she said. The evening after that was different, not transformed dramatically, not suddenly full of declarations, but different the way things are different when a door has been opened rather than closed. They sat out on the porch again with coffee and they talked, and at some point Ruth found his hand on the bench beside hers and turned her hand over, and he took it in the simple, honest way of a man who does not dress things up. She looked out at the stars with his hand in hers and thought about how many times she had sat on this porch alone and looked at the same stars and felt the great weight of her own solitude, and how different the same sky looked now. The next 2 weeks brought a change of rhythm on the homestead. Harvey was well enough to work now, not fully, not without care for his side, but functionally well, and he threw himself into the practical work of the place with an energy that was both useful and, Ruth admitted to herself, somewhat alarming in how good it felt to have the help. He fixed the pump that had been giving trouble since autumn. He found the weakness in the east fence that had been cut 3 times and reinforced it with an efficiency that suggested he was thinking about who might try to cut it again. He was thinking about Breck. She could see it in the way he scanned the far distance when he came out in the mornings, the way he kept track of where his horse was and whether the saddlebags were accessible. He was not afraid, but he was alert in the way of a man who knows a problem has not resolved itself simply because he has stopped actively looking at it. On a Wednesday afternoon, he said, I need to ride out to the Morales place and the Whitfield ranch. To ask them about testifying. Yes. And to warn them about Breck's surveying fraud in case they do not know the specifics. He paused. I would like you to come with me to the Morales place if you are willing. You know Elena Morales, do you not? I do. We have traded seeds and helped each other with preserving in the autumn. She may be more comfortable hearing this from a face she trusts. Ruth went with him to the Morales property, which was 6 miles south and east, and they arrived to find Elena Morales in her garden with her eldest daughter, a girl of about 12 who looked at Harvey with frank assessment before deciding he passed whatever test she was running. Elena Morales was a compact, determined woman in her late 30s who had built her homestead alongside her husband Miguel over 15 years and was not the kind of person to be easily unsettled. But when Harvey laid out the survey fraud showing her the documents, the discrepancies, the scope of what Breck had done, Ruth watched Elena's face go through several stages, from comprehension to anger to something that was very specifically the anger of a person who has suspected they were being played against for a long time and is now having the confirmation handed to them in documented form. I knew the survey was wrong, Elena said. I told Miguel in October. We know every foot of this land. We walked it when we came here. The creek runs where it runs, not where they say it runs. You were right, Harvey said, and I can prove it now. Elena looked at Ruth. Is this man trustworthy, Ruth? Ruth met her old neighbor's eyes. Yes, she said simply. Elena looked at Harvey again with the seriousness of a woman making a decision that might have serious consequences. What do you need from us? They spent 2 hours with the Morales family, and when they left, Elena had agreed to testify and Miguel had given them a detailed written account of the fence cutting and intimidation they had suffered over the past year. Old Mr. Whitfield, whom they visited the following day, was so furious at the documentary evidence of what had been done that he signed a statement on the spot and shook Harvey's hand with a grip that made Harvey briefly wince and then immediately smooth his expression. You all right? Ruth asked as they rode away from Whitfield's. Fine, Harvey said. He shook your good side. He is 80 years old and ranched in Kansas for 20 of them. He can shake my good side as hard as he wants. Ruth smiled to herself and did not say anything else about it. It was 2 days later that Breck's men came. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of horses on the road, more than one, moving at a deliberate pace. Harvey heard it too. He came to the door and looked out, and she saw him take in the 2 riders approaching along the road with the immediate calm of a man who has dealt with this kind of thing professionally. Go to the back room, he said quietly. No, Ruth said, in a tone that did not leave room for argument. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once, and she understood that he was respecting her decision, and they would discuss the wisdom of it later. The 2 men were not men she recognized. They were the kind of men who dressed hard and looked harder, the kind who wore guns at the hip like punctuation in a sentence. They stopped their horses at the edge of the yard, and the taller one called out, Is there a man named Harvey Covington on this property? Harvey stepped out onto the porch. Ruth stayed in the doorway behind him. There is, Harvey said. His voice was level. Mr. Breck sends his regards, the tall one said, in a tone that meant nothing good. He would like to let you know that whatever you have been up to lately is something you ought to stop doing. Tell Mr. Breck, Harvey said, that whatever I have been doing lately is a matter of public record at the county land office and also in a set of copies that are currently in the possession of 3 individuals, each of whom has been informed to send them to the Federal Circuit Court if anything unusual should happen. A pause. The shorter of the 2 men looked at his companion. We are just delivering a message, the tall one said, with somewhat less certainty than before. Message received, Harvey said. Is there anything else? There was a long pause in which the 2 men conducted what appeared to be a silent negotiation through minimal eye contact and small facial movements. Then they turned their horses and rode back the way they had come without another word. Ruth exhaled. Harvey stayed on the porch until they were well out of sight, his hands loose at his sides. Then he turned and came back in. "That was a bluff," he said, "about the copies." "I know," Ruth said. "It was a good bluff. I need to get those copies to the federal court faster than I had planned." He was already moving toward the back room where his leather journal was. "I will need to ride to Dodge City." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, ideally." He stopped and looked at her. "I do not want to leave you here alone while Breck's men are in the area." Ruth felt the weight of that, not his doubt in her ability to look after herself, but his care about what happened to her. It was a different kind of weight than the kind she was accustomed to carrying. "Send a message to Tom Gaines to come and stay here while you are gone," she said. "He has done it before when I traveled. He will come. And I have the rifle above the door and I know how to use it." Harvey looked at her for a long moment. "I know you do," he said. "I know you are capable of looking after yourself. I am not concerned about your capability." "Then what are you concerned about?" "I am concerned about being away from you," he said, quietly and directly, the way he had become. Ruth felt something catch in her chest. She walked toward him, and when she reached him she put her hand against his face, and he turned his face slightly into her hand, and she understood that he was not a man who had been touched with much gentleness and that the gentleness mattered to him. "Go to Dodge City," she said. "Do what needs to be done. Come back." He covered her hand with his. "I will come back," he said. It was a statement and a promise both. He rode out the next morning, and Tom Gaines arrived that afternoon, and the days that followed were full of the ordinary work of the homestead, but with an absence in them that Ruth had not anticipated, an awareness of the chair at the table that was empty, the quiet of the mornings without the sound of him in the back room, the evenings on the porch alone with coffee that tasted slightly less good than it had. She worked hard, the way she had always worked hard when she was troubled, going at the fence line and the garden and the stock with an energy that Tom commented on. "You are pushing it a little hard, don't you think?" he said on the third day. "I am behind on the garden," she said. Tom looked at her with the steady gaze of a man who has known someone for 4 years. "He seems like a good man," he said. Ruth did not look up from the row she was hoeing. He is coming back. He said he would." "Then he will," Tom said simply, and went back to fixing the pump housing. Harvey came back on the 9th day. Ruth was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she turned, and there he was coming along the road from the direction of Caldwell, sitting easy in the saddle with the spring sun on him, and she felt the loosening of something that had been held tight for 9 days. She walked to meet him and he dismounted, and the first thing he did was look at her, all of her, the way you look at someone when you have been worried about them at a distance and you need to see with your own eyes that they are all right. "You are fine," he said, with relief evident in his voice. "I am fine," she confirmed. "How did it go?" "The circuit judge's clerk received all the documentation," Harvey said. "I also filed a formal complaint against the deputy in the Wichita Marshal's office who removed me from the case, along with the evidence supporting the allegation of corruption. And I reached the federal marshal's field office in Dodge and lodged a full report." He paused. "It is in motion now. It will take time. The circuit judge comes through in 6 weeks, but it is in motion. Breck knows. He will know by now, yes, but he also knows that the evidence is in federal hands and that acting against any of the witnesses will only make his situation worse." Harvey looked at her directly. "He is not a stupid man. He is a greedy and unscrupulous one, but not stupid. He will spend the next 6 weeks talking to lawyers." Ruth nodded slowly. "And you?" He took her hand, which he had come to do naturally over the past weeks, with the ease of something that had found its place. "I would like to stay here, if you will have me, until the circuit judge comes through. I want to be present for the proceedings," and he paused and she could see him choosing his words with care. "And I have other reasons for wanting to stay, which you are aware of." "I am," she said. "Stay." Tom Gaines, who had been watching from the vicinity of the barn with polite inattention, apparently decided that his presence was no longer required and began making noises about needing to get home. "Tom," Harvey said, "thank you for looking after her." Tom waved a hand in a gesture that covered a range of sentiments from "you are welcome to, do not make it into something soppy, mounted his horse, and rode away. Ruth looked at Harvey. Harvey looked at Ruth. The spring morning sat around them full of birdsong and the smell of turned earth and the distant sound of wind in the grass. "I am glad you are back," she said. "There was nowhere else I was going," he said. They went inside, and she made coffee and they sat at the table, and he told her everything about Dodge City and the circuit court, and she told him about the 9 days she had spent here without him. And the conversation was easy and warm and full of the texture of two people who have become each other's primary confidants without quite deciding to. It was later that week, on a quiet evening after supper, that Harvey stood up from the table where he had been writing in his journal. He stood and set down his pen and turned to look at Ruth, who was mending at the other end of the table. "Ruth," he said. Something in his tone made her look up. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at her with that open, unguarded expression she had come to know as the one he wore when he was about to say something completely true. "Tell me who hurt you," he said. She went very still. "I do not mean Breck," he said quietly. "I mean before that. I have watched you these weeks, the way you brace yourself before you ask for anything, the way you apologize for taking up space, the way you work twice as hard as any person needs to work, because you seem to believe that you have to justify your presence in your own home." He came around the table and sat in the chair closest to her. "Someone taught you those things. Someone made you believe that you were too much trouble or not enough, and I have been trying to figure out whether to say this for some time." Ruth stared at him. The mending was in her lap and she was not moving. "Your father," she said finally. Her voice was quiet and very level. "Tell me," he said, and the invitation was not pressure. It was genuine and open and waiting. She put the mending on the table. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "He was not a cruel man. I want to be fair to him. He was a man who believed that suffering was ennobling and that the proper response to hardship was gratitude for the instruction it provided." She paused. "He held those beliefs more firmly in relation to others than to himself, as such men often do. When my mother became ill, she was expected to maintain the household for as long as she could, because to do less would have been self-pity. When I grieved her, I was told that excessive grief was a failure of faith." Harvey was listening with the focused stillness of someone who is genuinely hearing what you say. "When I married Daniel," she continued, "I was happy, genuinely happy. But I had already learned by then to be careful about taking up too much space, about wanting too much, about asking for help when I could manage without it. Daniel was a good man and he saw it in me and he worked against it. When he died, she stopped. When he died and then the baby, our son, he was born too early. I thought for a long time that the grief was something I should manage quietly and efficiently, the way I managed everything else." "You thought it was self-pity," Harvey said. "Yes." "And the fences Breck's men cut," Harvey said. "You did not tell anyone about it." "I thought I could manage it, because asking for help felt like admitting I could not do it alone," she said, "like giving someone ammunition." Harvey looked at her steadily, and in his eyes was something she recognized only gradually as genuine anger, not at her, but on her behalf. The kind of anger that arises in a person who cares deeply about someone and cannot bear what was done to them. "Ruth," he said, "you built this place by yourself after losing 2 people you loved. You took a stranger in off your land and nursed him back from a gunshot wound with nothing but your own knowledge and care. You rode into town with evidence that will bring down a corrupt operation and put the livelihoods of 7 families back on solid ground. You have been managing, as you call it, entirely on your own and making it look straightforward." He paused. "That is not someone who cannot manage alone. That is someone who never had to prove that they could keep managing alone." Her throat was very tight. "No one is going to take ammunition from you here," he said softly. "You are not too much trouble." "You are." He stopped and looked away briefly, and she could see him being precise about what he was about to say. He looked back at her. "You are the most remarkable person I have known. And I would like very much to spend whatever time I have after this business is finished trying to be worthy of that." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, but she did not look away. "Harvey Covington," she said, You are already that." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there together in the lamplight for a long time in the quiet that was no longer silence but something better, the particular peace that comes from being fully known. The 6 weeks before the circuit judge's arrival moved with a different quality than the weeks before them. There was still the tension of Breck's presence in the county, the knowledge that lawyers were being consulted and arguments were being constructed. But within the homestead, there was something that Ruth recognized, after some time thinking about it, as simply contentment, the warm, functional contentment of two people who have found a workable rhythm together and who have stopped pretending that they have not. Harvey helped her plant the summer garden. She taught him the particular way she had developed for dealing with the hard clay soil in the south corner, and he applied it with the careful patience he brought to everything he did with his hands. She helped him draft the clearest version of his evidence and testimony for the circuit judge, and they went over it in the evenings until he could lay it out in sequence without referring to his notes. He asked her one evening over the garden what she wanted, not about the legal case. He was clear about that. He asked what she wanted for herself, for her life, for the homestead, past all the immediate difficulties. She stood with her hands in the soil and thought about it honestly. "I want the land to be secure," she said. "I want to grow things and make them last. She paused. "I want to stop eating supper alone." He was kneeling beside the next row and he stopped and looked up at her. "That is something I can address," he said, with a seriousness that was also very nearly a smile. "Harvey." "Ruth." She threw a clod of dirt at him. He caught it, looked at it, and looked back at her with full and unambiguous amusement, and she started laughing, and he started laughing, and they were both laughing in the garden in the afternoon sun, and Ruth thought, this is what it is supposed to be like. The day of the circuit judge's proceedings came on a clear morning, in June of 1878. The hearing was held in Caldwell's largest room, which served as the town hall and civic gathering space, and on occasion as the venue for dances. Judge Henry Fairweather was a precise and serious man from the eastern districts who had a reputation for thoroughness, and who looked at the documentary evidence Harvey laid before him with the concentrated attention of someone who recognized the shape of systematic fraud. The testimony took 3 days. Ruth testified on the first day, laying out the original homestead claim, the fraudulent survey, the pattern of fence cutting, and the visit from Breck's representative with clear and calm precision that drew a murmur of comment from the room when she finished. Elena Morales testified on the second day, with Miguel's written account submitted alongside her oral testimony. Old Mr. Whitfield testified on the third day with the blunt, furious conviction of a man who has been wronged and is not going to be diplomatic about it. Harvey's testimony on the third day laid out the full structure of the operation, the fraudulent surveys, the link between Arthur Reed and Breck, the intimidation of landowners, the corruption in the Wichita marshal's office. He was precise and thorough and documented at every point, and when Breck's lawyer attempted to create ambiguity about the chain of evidence, Harvey walked through the documentation with an unhurried clarity that gave the lawyer very little room to maneuver. Judge Fairweather adjourned and deliberated for 2 days. When he returned his finding, it was comprehensive. Silas Breck's fraudulent land claims were voided. Arthur Reed's survey records were invalidated, and the matter referred for criminal prosecution. The case against the corrupt deputy in the Wichita marshal's office was formally noted and referred upward. All 7 affected landowners were confirmed in their original homestead holdings. The moment the finding was read, Ruth heard Elena Morales exhale very slowly beside her, a long breath of relief that sounded like it had been held for years. Outside the town hall, in the warm June afternoon, the small group of affected landowners gathered on the street, and there were handshakes and tears and expressions of relief in Spanish and English both. Old Whitfield gripped Harvey's hand again with that dangerous enthusiasm, and Harvey bore it without flinching this time. Ruth stood slightly to one side and watched Harvey, and the crowd watched him, accept the thanks of the people he had helped with a quiet grace that did not require him to be the center of attention. He deflected praise and redirected it toward the landowners themselves, toward their records and their memories of their own land boundaries, toward the fact that it had been the people themselves who knew the truth and were willing to say so. He looked up and found her watching him, and across the gathered crowd his expression was the open, unguarded one she loved best, and she held it for a moment like something precious. Alina Morales appeared at Ruth's elbow. "He is a good man," she said, not for the first time. "He is," Ruth said. Alina looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who has known her for years. "You are going to marry him," she said. Ruth looked at Alina. Alina looked back at her with entirely unreasonable equanimity. "We have not discussed it," Ruth said. "Then discuss it," Alina said, "and when to find Miguel." Ruth was still standing there with that thought when Harvey made his way through the crowd to her, and the noise and congratulation of the afternoon moved around them. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. "All of it," he said, meaning more than just the hearing. She met his eyes. "Almost," she said. Something shifted in his face. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night he asked who had hurt her directly and without artifice. "Ruth," he said, "I have been thinking about what comes after this." "Have you?" "I have left the Wichita deputy position formally, as of my written complaint to the federal marshal, which effectively ended that arrangement. I have nothing waiting for me in Wichita." He paused. "I have thought about what a man does when he has found the place and the person that make the most sense." Ruth's heart was moving somewhat faster than usual. "And what conclusions has he reached?" "That he should ask," Harvey said, "before he goes any further." He took her hands in both of his. Around them, the street of Caldwell went on in the ordinary way of an early summer afternoon, wagons and voices and the distant cattle sounds, and none of it registered much because she was looking at him. "I am asking," he said. "I am asking if you would be willing to have me permanently, not as a man who is recovering from a wound. As your partner, your husband, if you will have me. I will stay on this land if you will let me. I will work beside you. I will eat supper with you every night for as long as we have." He paused. "I will not tell you that you are too much trouble or make you prove that you deserve to take up space, and I will be asking you to tell me when something is wrong instead of managing it alone, because you have earned the right to be helped as many times as you have helped others." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Alina Morales watching from approximately 15 feet away with very little attempt at discretion, and of Tom Gaines observing from the other direction, and she found that she did not mind at all. "Yes," she said. "Harvey Covington, yes." He smiled, the full, warm, real smile that had first appeared across a kitchen table, and she felt it all the way through her. He pulled her in and held her there, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, solid and warm, and she thought about all the evenings on the porch alone and all the suppers and all the mornings she had woken to silence, and she thought that all of it, all the hard, quiet years, had been the long road to here, to this exact moment, and the road had not been wasted. Ruth Sutton and Harvey Covington were married on a Saturday in July of 1878, in the small Caldwell church, by the same minister who had married 3 other couples in the county that summer, and who performed the ceremony with a genuine warmth that Ruth appreciated. Alina Morales stood up for Ruth, and Tom Gaines stood up for Harvey, and old Mr. Whitfield attended and wept openly and made no apology for it. Harvey wore his good shirt and a new vest he had bought in Caldwell, that weak, dark blue wool, which Ruth told him later that evening looked very well on him. Ruth wore the dress she had altered from the good gray wool that had been at the back of her trunk for the last year, and a half it fit her exactly right and fell beautifully. And when she came down the aisle, Harvey looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying very hard to maintain composure and is not entirely succeeding. They said their vows in the clear and specific language of the Episcopal service, each word of it clear and meaning something, and when it was done and Harvey turned to her with his hands holding hers and his eyes on her face, Ruth felt the settling of something, some long-held tension in her body finally released. The particular relief of arriving after a journey you were not sure had a destination. The homestead became, in the months that followed, something Ruth had not entirely believed it could be, genuinely full. Harvey brought to it all the things she had learned to manage without a second pair of capable hands: a voice in the evenings, laughter, someone to discuss things with, someone who noticed when she was tired and said so. He also brought a particular skill with horses that meant the hay and grain operations expanded, and by the late summer of that year, they had 3 additional horses in the barn, and a small but growing reputation for good stock in the surrounding county. He was methodical and careful with the finances in a way that complemented Ruth's own carefulness, and together they found they had more room than either had separately. Harvey's formal position with law enforcement remained concluded. He had submitted his written report, the Wichita matter had been investigated, and the corrupt deputy dismissed, and the federal circuit had noted Harvey's role in the Breck case with approval. An offer came through the following spring from the Caldwell Town Council. They were forming a proper town marshal's office, and wondered if Harvey Covington would consider the position. Harvey brought the letter to Ruth and set it on the table between them the way he brought everything that required a joint decision squarely between them, not already decided. "What do you think?" he said. Ruth read the letter. She looked at him. "Do you want it?" "I want what works for both of us." "That is a thoughtful answer," she said, "but I asked what you want." He considered. "I am good at the work," he said, "and Caldwell needs someone who will do it honestly, but I also want to be here. I do not want the work to take me away from this." "The town marshal's position is a town position," Ruth said. "You would not be riding circuit, you would be home every night." Something eased in his expression. "Yes." "Then I think," Ruth said, "that you should accept." He took the position, and he was good at it, steady and fair, known throughout Caldwell for a particular kind of calm authority that was not about intimidation, but about clarity. He settled disputes and tracked down a cattle thief, and once talked 2 armed men into putting down their guns through the somewhat extraordinary method of standing in the street between them and speaking at a very reasonable volume until they got tired of the situation. He was home every evening for supper. Their first child was born in the spring of 1880, a boy they named Thomas Daniel Covington Thomas for Tom Gaines, who had been present at the wedding and was somewhere between a neighbor and a member of the family, and Daniel for Ruth's first husband, which Harvey had suggested himself, in the way of a man secure enough in the present not to be threatened by the history that had made his wife who she was. Thomas Daniel arrived at 4 in the morning on an April day with the spring wind rattling the windows, and Harvey sat beside Ruth through all of it and held her hand when she needed it, and stayed out of Doc Morrison's way when he needed that, and was awake and entirely present for the moment his son drew his first breath and announced himself to the world. He held the baby with the careful reverence of a man who has not held many babies and is aware of the weight of the responsibility. The baby was small and red and furious about existing, and Harvey looked at him with an expression Ruth had never seen on him before, undone, completely, in the best possible way. "Thomas Daniel Covington," Harvey said, as though testing the name against reality. "He looks like you," Ruth said from the pillow, though she was not entirely sure that was true yet. "He looks like a very unhappy small person," Harvey said. "He had a difficult morning." Harvey looked at her, all the emotion of the previous hours present in his face, undisguised. "How are you?" "Tired," Ruth said honestly, "and very happy." He sat on the edge of the bed with the baby still in his arms, and leaned forward and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that she held on to. Elena Morales came to see the baby that afternoon and proclaimed him handsome in the Covington manner, which Ruth interpreted as a specific compliment to Harvey. Tom Gaines came by and held the baby with the awkward sincerity of a bachelor who is not practiced but is willing, and the baby looked at him with the unfocused gravity of the very young. Old Mr. Whitfield sent a package that arrived the following week, a hand-carved wooden rattle, made with care, and a note that said only well done to both of you, which Ruth pinned to the wall in the baby's room, and which made her cry a little for reasons she considered entirely reasonable. Thomas Daniel was a good baby, not always easy, because babies by nature are not always easy, but he had his father's steadiness in him from early on, and his mother's directness, and the combination produced a child who knew what he wanted and went straight at it without much preliminary drama. Harvey found this amusing. Ruth found it exactly what she had expected. The year Thomas Daniel turned 2, they added a second room to the house, the one Ruth had always meant to add but had not had the labor or the reason. Harvey built it himself with Tom Gaines' help, and Ruth helped where she could, and the sound of construction filled the homestead for 3 weeks in a satisfying way. In the spring of 1883, their daughter arrived, a girl they called Mary Elena Covington, the middle name for Elena Morales, who wept when she heard it and then composed herself and said she was not crying at all. Mary Elena came into the world with considerably less drama than her brother had and looked around at everything immediately, which Doc Morrison said was a very good sign. She had Ruth's calm eyes and Harvey's tendency to take inventory of a situation before reacting, and by the time she was a year old, she had already developed the habit of watching her father with intense attention when he was working, and then attempting to replicate whatever he had just done. Harvey, for his part, took to fatherhood with a sincerity and commitment that Ruth had suspected he would, but which still moved her every time she saw it in action. The way he read to both children in the evenings, the way he answered their questions with the same honest directness he brought to everything, the way he told Thomas Daniel and Mary Elena both that they were loved and that their opinions mattered, the way he apologized to them when he was wrong about something, which Ruth thought was one of the most important things a parent could do. He kept the town marshal's position through the 80s, serving Caldwell with the same steady integrity through the changes that the decade brought, the cattle trade shifting, the territory's character evolving, the town growing up around itself. He was reappointed twice without opposition, which in Caldwell in that era was as close to universal approval as the community ever gave anyone. Ruth expanded the homestead's operations gradually and methodically. The horse stock became genuinely notable within 3 counties, and she managed the business side of it with a precision that she had developed over years of managing alone, and which was now applied to something growing rather than simply maintained. She also kept a kitchen garden of remarkable productivity that supplied not only the household, but a portion of the town market in summer, and she and Elena Morales had developed a seed-sharing arrangement that had over the years become something both their families considered a tradition. Silas Breck, for his part, had eventually relocated to Texas after the circuit judge's ruling, his operation in Kansas having been rendered legally untenable. Word came back occasionally through the network of information that exists in any frontier region he had found new ways to be profitable and new territories in which to pursue them, and whether he had moderated his methods was a matter of some doubt. But he was not Ruth's problem anymore, and the land she had homesteaded with Daniel and held against all of it was now thriving under her stewardship. The fraudulent surveyor Arthur Reed had faced prosecution and received a sentence of 3 years in the federal penitentiary, after which he had apparently gone east and disappeared from any record Ruth or Harvey were aware of. The deputy in the Wichita marshal's office who had accepted Breck's payments had been dismissed and stripped of his position, which was, as Harvey noted, the least that could have happened, but at least it had happened. On an evening in the autumn of 1884, when Thomas Daniel was 4 and Mary Elena had just turned 1, and was conducting a close and somewhat sticky investigation of the kitchen floor, Ruth sat on the porch with Harvey in the particular golden quality of the Kansas autumn light, the same porch where she had sat alone in the years before him, and watched the same sky with a different feeling. The homestead spread out before them in the fading light, the barn, solid and well-maintained, the fields already harvested and at rest, the horses moving in the near pasture with the easy grace of well-kept animals. Smoke from the chimney. A dog that had adopted them 6 months ago lying across the porch step. Thomas Daniel came out the front door at that moment, carrying his wooden horse with extreme ceremony, and went to sit on the step beside the dog. "Papa," he said, without looking up from his horse. "Yes," Harvey said. "Did you really fall off your horse and then Mama fixed you?" Harvey looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him with the composed expression of a woman who had been waiting to see how this question arrived. "Yes," Harvey said. "That is essentially what happened." Thomas Daniel considered this with the serious weight he brought to most things. "That was lucky," he decided. "Very lucky," Harvey agreed. "For you," Thomas Daniel said, in the tone of a 4-year-old who has determined the winner of a transaction. "Yes," Harvey said, and looked at Ruth with a smile that was warm and certain and entirely without qualification. "Very much for me." Ruth looked at her husband and her son and the land around them in the autumn light, and she felt the full weight of it, all of it, the grief and the work and the hard years, and the stranger who had fallen out of the sky into her yard on a Thursday morning in April, bleeding and unconscious and more alive than he knew, and everything that had grown from that single improbable morning into this house, these children, this man beside her, this life. She reached over and took Harvey's hand. He held it in both of his, the way he always did, carefully, as though it was something worth holding. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the evening sky, deep blue at the top and going orange and gold at the horizon, the first stars beginning to appear. "That I am very glad," she said, "that I ran toward instead of away." He turned her hand over in his. "As am I," he said quietly. Mary Alina's voice came from inside the house, a loud, declarative sound that indicated she had found something interesting or had a strong opinion about the current state of affairs, which with Mary Alina were often the same thing. Ruth and Harvey both laughed, and Thomas Daniel looked up from his horse with the expression of an older sibling, who has accepted that his life now includes a smaller and louder person. And the evening settled around the homestead with all the peace and warmth of a life that had been built slowly and kept carefully, and was, by any honest accounting, exactly what it was supposed to be. Inside, the fire was warm. Outside, the stars were opening up across the Kansas sky, the same stars Ruth had watched alone for 4 years from this same porch, now watched together. Harvey's thumb moved across her knuckles in the small, habitual gesture of a man who is content. The dog exhaled deeply on the step. Thomas Daniel's wooden horse made its quiet journey across the porch boards, and Ruth Sutton, Ruth Covington now, though she still thought of herself in both names because both were hers and she had earned both, sat in the evening air of her own land and breathed it in, every bit of it, the good work and the good people and the good years stretching ahead. She had once believed that the kind of life she wanted was the kind she had to earn alone, prove she deserved alone, maintain alone. She had managed it, she had been capable of managing it, but managing and living were not the same thing, and the difference between them was sitting right beside her, warm and solid and holding her hand. A shooting star crossed the Kansas sky, gone in a moment. "Did you see that?" Harvey said. "I saw it," Ruth said. Thomas Daniel had seen it too. He looked up and pointed and said with great satisfaction, "Star." "Star," Harvey confirmed. Ruth tipped her head against Harvey's shoulder, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head, and Thomas Daniel returned to his wooden horse. And inside the house, Mary Alina had apparently made peace with whatever had concerned her and gone quiet, and the night came down gently over the homestead, full of stars, full of the sounds of a living and inhabited land, full of everything that it meant to have stayed and worked and waited, and opened a door on an ordinary Thursday morning when a stranger fell off his horse in the yard. Everything, as it turned out, had been exactly where it needed to be.